A small black girl stood alone in court, trembling. When asked about her mother, her next words made even the judge wipe away tears. Sarah's shoes dragged against the worn carpet of the third-floor hallway. The backpack weighed heavy on her small shoulders as she reached into her pocket for the key. Her fingers trembled slightly as she inserted it into the lock of apartment 3B. The door creaked open to darkness and silence. "Mom," she called out, knowing there wouldn't be an answer. There never was at this time. The 11-year-old flicked on the lights, illuminating the modest living room. A few dishes from breakfast still sat in the sink, and her mother's nursing scrubs from the previous night hung over a kitchen chair to dry. The clock on the microwave blinked 3:47 p.m. Sarah dropped her backpack by the coffee table and pulled out her homework. The TV remote sat within easy reach, her constant companion during these lonely afternoons. She turned it on, keeping the volume low, just enough to fill the emptiness of the apartment. As she worked on her math problems, her stomach growled. The last time she'd eaten was at lunch, and that felt like ages ago. She walked to the kitchen and opened the refrigerator. Inside, she found a container with a sticky note. Leftover spaghetti from Monday. Heat for 2 minutes. Love you, baby mom. The sight of her mother's handwriting triggered a memory she'd been trying to suppress. 3 years ago, she'd found a different note on the kitchen table. Her father's handwriting had been messy, rushed. "I can't do this anymore. I'm sorry." That was the last time she'd seen him. The microwave hummed as it heated her dinner. Sarah stared at her reflection in the kitchen window, seeing a small girl with braided hair and a blue dress that had seen better days. Her mother always made sure it was clean, though, even if it was a bit worn. The phone rang, startling her. She rushed to answer it, knowing who it would be. "Hi, baby." Her mother's tired voice came through. "How was school?" "It was okay, Mom. Mrs. Peterson asked about you again. Parent-teacher conferences are next week." A heavy sigh from the other end. "I know, baby. I'm trying to switch shifts, but we're short-staffed at the hospital." "Did you start your homework?" "Yeah, just doing math now." "When are you coming home?" "That's why I'm calling, sweetheart. They need me to cover the night shift. Nancy called in sick, and it's okay, Mom. I understand." Sarah's voice remained steady, practiced in hiding her disappointment. "There's spaghetti in the fridge. I found it. I'm heating it up now. Make sure to lock up before bed. All the windows too, okay? And don't answer the door for anyone." "I know, Mom. That's my girl. I'll try to be home before you leave for school tomorrow." "I love you so much, Sarah." "Love you too, Mom." The line went dead, and Sarah returned to her cooling spaghetti. She ate at the coffee table, textbook open beside her plate, the TV news providing background noise she wasn't really listening to. Hours passed. Sarah's eyes grew heavy as she curled up on the couch, her math homework completed, but her mother's medical textbook open on her lap. She often read it, trying to understand the world that kept her mother away so many nights. The diagrams and big words usually put her to sleep, and tonight was no exception. The sound of heavy footsteps in the hallway jerked her awake. The TV was still on, casting shifting shadows across the dark apartment. The clock read 2:13 a.m. Sarah's heart pounded as the footsteps stopped outside their door. A loud knock made her jump. "Chicago Police Department. Open up." Sarah froze, her mother's warnings echoing in her head. "Don't answer the door for anyone." "Chicago Police. We need to speak with Janet Johnson." Another knock, harder this time. Sarah pulled her knees to her chest, trying to make herself smaller on the couch. "We have a warrant. We're coming in." The door burst open with a crash that seemed to shake the whole apartment. Sarah screamed as multiple flashlight beams cut through the darkness, landing on her trembling form. "Where's Janet Johnson?" a stern voice demanded. She's at work," Sarah managed to say, her voice barely a whisper. A woman in a blazer stepped forward, lowering herself to Sarah's eye level. Her badge read Child Services. "Hi, Sarah. I'm Ms. Torres. We need you to come with us." "Okay. We'll explain everything." Sarah's fingers dug into the couch cushions. "I can't. I have to wait for my mom. She said not to go with anyone. Your mother's been detained at the hospital, sweetheart. You can't stay here alone." "Detained? What does that mean? What does she do?" Ms. Torres reached for Sarah's hand. We'll explain everything at the station. Do you have a bag you can pack? Just some clothes and things you'll need for a few days. Sarah's world spun as she stumbled to her room, Ms. Torres following close behind. With shaking hands, she pulled her school backpack open, dumping the books onto her bed. She grabbed whatever clothes were closest, not even sure what she was packing. Don't forget your toothbrush, Ms. Torres reminded her gently. In the bathroom, Sarah caught her reflection again. The same girl from earlier, but now her eyes were wide with fear, her braids messy from sleeping on the couch. She grabbed her toothbrush, toothpaste, and the small bottle of coconut oil her mother used on her hair. As they let her out of the apartment, Sarah looked back one last time. The door hung awkwardly on its hinges, the lock broken. Her math homework lay scattered on the coffee table. The TV still played quietly to an empty room. Your mom's going to be okay, Ms. Torres said, guiding her toward the elevator. We just need to sort some things out. But Sarah barely heard her. All she could think about was her mother's voice on the phone just hours ago. I love you so much, Sarah. She should have said it back more than once. The police station smelled like coffee and cleaning supplies. Sarah sat in a hard plastic chair, her backpack clutched to her chest like a shield. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, making her eyes hurt after the darkness of her apartment. Are you hungry? Ms. Torres set a vending machine sandwich and a bottle of water in front of her. Sarah shook her head, even though her stomach felt empty. The half-eaten spaghetti from hours ago seemed like a different lifetime. Can I call my mom now? Sarah asked for the third time. Not yet, sweetheart. We need to wait until morning. It's almost 4 a.m. Ms. Torres checked her phone. Try to get some rest. We'll sort everything out when the sun comes up. But Sarah couldn't rest. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the police breaking down their door. A constant stream of officers and late-night staff walked past her chair, some glancing at her with pitying looks, others too busy with their own work to notice. Janet Johnson's kid? A tall detective stopped in front of them, coffee cup in hand. Ms. Torres nodded. This is Sarah. Poor timing, all this. He shook his head. Hospital saying it was a misunderstanding, but the complaint's already filed. System's got to run its course now. What complaint? Sarah's voice cracked. What did my mom do? The adults exchanged looks over her head. Your mother's been accused of negligence at work, Ms. Torres explained carefully. There was an incident with a patient, and my mom's the best nurse. Sarah stood up suddenly, her backpack falling to the floor. She works so hard. She's always helping people. Sit down, Sarah. Ms. Torres's voice was firm but gentle. No one's saying she's not a good nurse. But when accusations like this happen, they have to investigate. She paused. They found out you've been staying home alone at night. Sarah's stomach dropped. She'd always known it was supposed to be a secret, those nights alone. Her mother had drilled it into her head. Don't tell anyone. Keep the lights low. Don't let anyone know. The sun was rising when they finally left the police station. Ms. Torres drove a silver sedan that smelled like air freshener and old French fries. Sarah watched the city wake up through the window. Streets she knew, but somehow looked different in the early morning light. They pulled up to a two-story house with peeling white paint. This is Mrs. Carter's place, Ms. Torres explained. She takes care of kids temporarily when they need a place to stay. The front door opened before they reached it. Mrs. Carter was a large woman with gray hair tied back in a bun. She wore a floral housecoat and practical shoes. You must be Sarah, she said, stepping aside to let them in. I've got a room ready upstairs. You'll be sharing with Tanya, but she's still asleep. The room was small, with two twin beds. One was covered in pink blankets and stuffed animals. The other was bare except for clean white sheets. Sarah set her backpack on the empty bed. Get some sleep, Ms. Torres said. I'll be back later to take you to see your mom. As soon as they left her alone, Sarah curled up on the bed, still fully dressed. She pressed her face into the unfamiliar pillow and finally let herself cry. The tears came silently. She'd learned long ago how to cry without making noise. She must have fallen asleep because suddenly there was sunlight streaming through the window and a girl about her age was standing over her bed. You the new kid? The girl, Tanya, asked. Mrs. Carter says breakfast is ready. Sarah followed her downstairs to a kitchen that smelled like pancakes. Two other kids already sat at the table. A boy maybe 7 years old and a teenage girl who didn't look up from her phone. "Eat up," Mrs. Carter said, placing a plate in front of Sarah. Miss Torres called. "She'll be here at noon to take you to the detention center." The pancakes tasted like cardboard in Sarah's mouth. Detention center? That's where they keep the grown-ups who get in trouble, Tanya explained through a mouthful of food. "My mom's been there 3 times. Sarah pushed her plate away. The detention center was a gray building with small windows and metal detectors at the entrance. Miss Torres led her through multiple security checks. Sarah's hands shook as she placed her backpack on the conveyor belt. "Remember," Miss Torres said as they walked down a long hallway, "you'll be separated by glass. You could talk through a phone. 15 minutes? Okay." Sarah nodded, not trusting herself to speak. They entered a room with chairs lined up in front of glass partitions. On the other side, women in orange jumpsuits sat in similar chairs. "Mom." Sarah pressed her hands against the glass. Her mother looked tired, her hair messy, dark circles under her eyes. But she smiled when she saw Sarah, pressing her hand against the glass to match her daughter's. They both reached for the phones. "Baby, I'm so sorry." Her mother's voice crackled through the receiver. "I never meant for any of this to happen." "What happened, Mom? Why are you here?" "There was a mix-up with a patient's medication. Someone filed a complaint, and when they investigated," she wiped her eyes, "they found out about leaving you alone at night. They're saying it's child endangerment. But I'm okay. I can take care of myself." "I know you can, baby. You're so strong. But it's not legal what I did. I thought I had no choice. Working 2 shifts was the only way to pay the bills after your father." Sarah gripped the phone tighter. "When can you come home?" "I don't know yet. My lawyer says it might take a few days, maybe longer. But I'm going to fix this, Sarah. I promise." "I'll help," Sarah said firmly. "I'll tell them how good you are, how you take care of me." The lawyer mentioned that. "They might want you to testify in court, like on TV." Her mother managed a small laugh. "Something like that. Just tell the truth, okay?" "Tell them." A buzzer sounded, making them both jump. "Time's up," a guard announced. "I love you, Sarah. Be brave for me." "I love you too, Mom. I'll be brave." Sarah watched her mother being led away, still wearing her hospital scrubs from the night they arrested her. Miss Torres touched her shoulder. "Ready to go?" Back at Mrs. Carter's, Sarah went straight to her shared room. She pulled out her mother's medical textbook, the one thing she'd remembered to pack, and opened it to a random page. The words blurred as she tried to read. Downstairs, she could hear the other kids watching TV, laughing at something. Mrs. Carter called up that dinner would be ready soon. But Sarah stayed on her bed, holding the book that smelled like home, waiting for a phone call that wouldn't come. On her nightstand, the court summons Miss Torres had given her seemed to glow in the fading daylight. The words, "Witness Summons," stared back at her in bold black letters. Sarah touched the paper, her fingers tracing the court date. 5 days. She had 5 days to find the courage to stand up in front of strangers and fight for her mother. The sound of dinner plates clinking downstairs mixed with Tanya's laughter and Mrs. Carter's muffled voice calling her name again. But Sarah remained still, her mind already in that courtroom, rehearsing what she would say to bring her mother home. "And what will you say when the judge asks about your daily routine?" Miss Torres sat across from Sarah in Mrs. Carter's living room. Outside, rain tapped against the windows, creating a steady rhythm. Sarah twisted the hem of her shirt. "I go to school, come home, do my homework, and then Mom comes home from work." Miss Torres leaned forward. "Sarah, we need to be honest. Your mom wasn't always home, was she?" Sarah stared at her hands. 3 days had passed since her mother's arrest, and they'd been practicing her testimony every afternoon. The words felt like rocks in her mouth. "No," she whispered. "Sometimes she worked night shifts." "And where were you during those nights?" "Home. Alone." Sarah nodded, her throat tight. "The judge needs to hear you say it, Sarah. They need to understand your situation." "I was alone." The words came out sharp, angry. "But I was okay. Mom called to check on me. I knew how to heat up food. I did my homework. I never opened the door. I never." Her voice broke. Miss Torres handed her a tissue. "I know this is hard, but lying in court would only make things worse." That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. Tanya's steady breathing from the other bed only made her feel more awake. She slipped out from under the covers and went to the window, pressing her forehead against the cool glass. The nightmare was still fresh in her mind. She'd been standing in court, but when she opened her mouth to speak, her father's voice came out instead. "I can't do this anymore. I'm sorry." Then her mother was being led away in handcuffs, disappearing like her father had, leaving Sarah alone in the big, empty courtroom. A floorboard creaked behind her. Mrs. Carter stood in the doorway, wearing her usual floral housecoat. "Can't sleep?" she asked softly, careful not to wake Tanya. Sarah shook her head. "Come on. Hot chocolate helps everything." In the kitchen, Mrs. Carter moved with quiet efficiency, heating milk on the stove and stirring in cocoa powder. She placed a steaming mug in front of Sarah. "You know," Mrs. Carter said, sitting down with her own mug, "I've been doing this for 20 years, taking care of kids while their parents sort things out." Sarah wrapped her hands around the warm cup. "Did they all get their parents back?" "Most of them. Some didn't." Mrs. Carter's voice was gentle but honest. "But the ones who did, they fought for it, just like you're doing." "I'm scared," Sarah admitted. "What if I say something wrong? What if they don't believe me?" "Just tell the truth. That's all anyone can ask of you." The next morning, Miss Torres arrived with a garment bag. "We need to pick out what you'll wear to court." In Sarah's shared room, she unzipped the bag to reveal 3 dresses. One was navy blue, simple but neat. It reminded Sarah of her mother's nursing scrubs. "Try this one first," Miss Torres suggested. Sarah changed behind the closet door. The dress fit well, not too tight, not too loose. When she looked in the mirror, she saw someone older than her 11 years. "Perfect," Miss Torres nodded. "Now let's practice one more time. When you enter the courtroom, I walk to the witness stand," Sarah recited. "I put my right hand up and swear to tell the truth. I sit down and answer questions. And if you don't understand a question, I ask them to explain it. And if you need a break, I tell the judge." They practiced until lunchtime. Sarah's head buzzed with instructions. "Speak clearly. Look at the person asking questions. Tell the truth. Don't fidget." The drive to the courthouse the next morning felt like hours, though Mrs. Carter's house was only 20 minutes away. Sarah sat in the back of Ms. Torres's car, watching the city blur past. Her stomach churned with each traffic light. They pulled into the courthouse parking lot far too soon. The building loomed above them, all stone and serious windows. Other people climbed the steps, carrying briefcases and files. Sarah clutched her mother's medical textbook. She'd insisted on bringing it, like a good luck charm. Inside, the air conditioning made her shiver in her blue dress. Miss Torres led her through security, then down a long hallway to a small waiting room. A man in a suit was already there. "Sarah, this is Mr. Patterson, your mother's lawyer." Mr. Patterson smiled, but his eyes were tired. "Hello, Sarah. Ready for today?" Before she could answer, the door opened. 2 police officers led someone in, and Sarah's heart jumped. "Mom!" Her mother wore an orange jumpsuit, but her hair was neatly braided, her face clean. She looked smaller somehow, but her smile was the same. "Baby girl," she breathed, taking a step forward. The officers didn't stop her as she knelt to hug Sarah. "You look so beautiful." Sarah buried her face in her mother's shoulder. Breathing in the unfamiliar prison soap smell mixed with her mom's familiar scent. "I missed you. I missed you too. So much." Her mother pulled back, holding Sarah's shoulders. "Remember what we talked about on the phone? Just tell the truth. That's all you need to do. What if it's not enough? It will be. You're stronger than you know, Sarah." Just like a knock at the door made them all turn. A court officer stood there. "They're ready?" Sarah's mother squeezed her hands one last time before the police officers led her away. Mr. Patterson straightened his tie. "Okay, Sarah. Deep breath. Remember what we practiced." They walked down another hallway, this one with wooden doors on either side. Miss Torres touched Sarah's arm. "I'll be right in the gallery, okay? Just look at me if you get nervous." The courtroom doors opened. The room was bigger than Sarah had imagined, with high ceilings and rows of wooden benches. People turned to look as she entered. She caught a glimpse of her mother sitting at a table with Mr. Patterson. But what made her steps falter was the judge's bench, raised high above everything else, like a throne. And sitting there, looking down at her with stern eyes, was Judge Henderson. Sarah's fingers tightened around her mother's textbook as she walked forward. Each step echoed in the quiet room. She could feel everyone watching, waiting to hear what this small girl in a blue dress would say. The bailiff stepped forward. "Raise your right hand." Sarah did, her arm trembling slightly. "Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?" She thought of her lonely nights at home, of her mother working double shifts to keep them afloat, of all the secrets they kept to survive. "I do," she said, and her voice didn't shake at all. The witness chair creaked as Sarah sat down. It was too big for her. Her feet barely touched the floor. She placed her mother's medical textbook in her lap, holding onto it like an anchor. Judge Henderson peered down at her over reading glasses. Her gray hair was pulled back tight, her black robe crisp and imposing. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across her face. "State your name for the record," the judge said. "Sarah Johnson." Her voice came out small in a large room. "How old are you, Sarah?" 11, Your Honor. Just like they'd practiced. "Do you understand why you're here today?" Sarah glanced at her mother, then quickly back to the judge. "Yes, it's about my mom." Mr. Patterson stood up, buttoning his suit jacket. "Sarah, can you tell us about a typical day in your life?" She gripped the textbook tighter. "I wake up at 6:30. Mom usually makes breakfast if she's home from her night shift. If not, I make cereal, and after school, I come home, do my homework, watch TV sometimes." "Who's with you after school?" Sarah's throat tightened. "Nobody. Mom's at work." "And at night?" A tear slid down her cheek. She wiped it away quickly, but more followed. The courtroom blurred. "Would you like some water?" Judge Henderson's voice had softened slightly. Sarah nodded. A court officer brought her a paper cup. Her hands shook as she took a sip. "Take your time," Mr. Patterson said gently. But before Sarah could continue, a new voice cut through the silence. "Your Honor, if I may." A man in a sharp gray suit stood up from the prosecution table. His tie was the color of blood. "Proceed, Mr. Wells," Judge Henderson said. The prosecutor approached the witness stand. His shoes clicked against the floor with each step. "Sarah, how many nights per week would you say you spent alone?" I don't know. It depended on Mom's schedule. Give us your best estimate." Sarah looked at Ms. Torres in the gallery, who gave her an encouraging nod. "Maybe 4 or 5 nights?" 4 or 5 nights a week, alone in an apartment. No adult supervision. Is that correct? But I was okay. Sarah's voice cracked. Mom called to check on me. She taught me what to do if... Just answer yes or no, please. Were you alone 4 to 5 nights per week? Yes, she whispered. What did you do for dinner on these nights? Mom left food in the fridge, with notes about how long to heat it, and if there was an emergency, if you got sick, if there was a fire. Sarah's hands clenched around the textbook. I knew the emergency numbers. Mom wrote them all down. And Mrs. Rodriguez, next door. Did Mrs. Rodriguez know you were alone? No. So, in an emergency, you would have been completely on your own? Mr. Patterson stood up. Objection, Your Honor. He's badgering the witness. Sustained. Watch your tone, Mr. Wells. The prosecutor adjusted his tie. Let's talk about the night your mother was arrested. You were alone then, weren't you? Sarah nodded. Verbal response, please. Yes, I was alone. What time was it when the police arrived? Around 2 in the morning. And you were still awake? I fell asleep on the couch. The noise woke me up. The noise of the police breaking down your door, correct? Because you wouldn't answer? Fresh tears spilled down Sarah's cheeks. Mom said never to open the door at night. Never for anyone, even the police? Anyone. Mr. Wells walked back to his table, picked up a file. Your Honor, I'd like to enter into evidence reports from Child Protective Services documenting multiple instances of neglect. Objection. Mr. Patterson was on his feet again. These reports are based solely on the fact that Ms. Johnson worked night shifts. There's no evidence of actual neglect. The child was left alone for hours, counselor. Multiple nights per week. That's the definition of neglect. Judge Henderson raised her hand. I'll allow the reports, but let's take a 15-minute recess. Sarah, you can step down for now. Sarah practically ran from the witness stand. Ms. Torres met her halfway down the aisle, leading her out to the hallway. They found a quiet corner near a water fountain. You're doing great, Miss Torres said, handing her more tissues. Sarah slid down the wall until she was sitting on the floor, her blue dress fanning out around her. No, I'm not. I'm crying like a baby. And that man, he makes it sound so bad. Mr. Wells is doing his job. But you're doing yours too, telling the truth. The truth is making everything worse. Miss Torres sat down next to her on the floor, not caring about her own suit. Sometimes things have to get worse before they can get better. Your mom made some mistakes, but she did it because she loves you. The judge needs to understand that. Sarah opened the medical textbook, flipping through pages of diagrams and long words. Mom's studying to be a registered nurse. She already has her LPN, but RNs make more money. She says once she finishes school, she won't need to work so many shifts. That's important information, Sarah. The judge should hear that. But Mr. Wells won't let me explain anything. He just wants yes or no. Then we'll find a way to tell the whole story. Ready to go back in? Sarah looked at her reflection in the polished floor tiles. Her eyes were red from crying, her braids slightly messy. But when she stood up, her spine straightened. Wait, she said, reaching up to fix her hair. Mom always says to look professional in front of important people. They walked back into the courtroom, just as the bailiff called for everyone to rise. Judge Henderson returned to her bench, adjusting her glasses. Mr. Wells, you may continue your questioning. The prosecutor stood, straightening papers on his desk. Sarah climbed back into the witness chair, setting the textbook in her lap once more. This time, she opened it to the chapter about emergency care, her mother's favorite section, with all her handwritten notes in the margins. Sarah, Mr. Wells began, let's talk about the night your father left. Her fingers found her mother's handwriting on the page. Always assess the situation before acting. She took a deep breath, ready for whatever came next. The night your father left, Mr. Wells repeated, his voice echoing in the quiet courtroom. You were 8 years old, correct? Yes. Sarah's fingers traced her mother's handwriting in the textbook. And after he left, that's when your mother started working double shifts? She had to. We needed money. Did she look for other options? Daycare? After-school programs? Sarah shifted in the large chair. She tried, but they were too expensive. So instead, she left an 8-year-old alone at night? Not right away. Sarah glanced at her mother, who sat rigid at the defense table. First, she tried leaving me with neighbors, but they started asking questions about payment. Mr. Wells picked up another file from his table. Your Honor, I'd like to present evidence from the Social Services investigation. He walked to the witness stand, placing a stack of papers on the ledge in front of Sarah. She recognized her apartment building in some of the photos. These documents show multiple complaints from neighbors about noise late at night. Can you explain that? Sarah stared at the papers. Sometimes I had nightmares. After Dad left, and your mother wasn't there to comfort you? She called as soon as she could. She always called. Mr. Wells turned a page in the file. According to Mrs. Rodriguez in apartment 3A, she often heard you crying through the walls. She assumed your mother was home, but ignoring you. She had no idea you were alone. Tears burned behind Sarah's eyes, but she held them back this time. Mom didn't ignore me. She was working to take care of me. By leaving you alone? In an apartment with broken locks? In a neighborhood with one of the highest crime rates in Chicago? Objection. Mr. Patterson stood. Argumentative. Sustained, Judge Henderson said. Mr. Wells, stick to the facts. The prosecutor nodded, but his eyes stayed fixed on Sarah. Let's talk about school. Your teachers reported multiple instances of you falling asleep in class. Why was that? Sarah's throat felt tight. Sometimes I waited up for Mom, even on school nights. I wanted to make sure she got home okay. And your grades? They've dropped significantly in the past year. They're not that bad, Sarah protested. I still get BS mostly, but you used to get all A's, didn't you? Before your mother started leaving you alone. Mr. Patterson stood again. Objection, Your Honor. The prosecution is trying to establish a correlation without. I'll rephrase. Mr. Wells cut in. Sarah, has being alone at night affected your schoolwork? Sarah looked down at the medical textbook. The page showed a diagram of the human heart, with her mother's neat notes around it. The heart can compensate for tremendous stress, but eventually, something has to give. Sometimes it's hard to concentrate, she admitted. When I'm tired, but I'm trying really hard. And your mother? Does she help with your homework? When she can. She checks it in the morning sometimes, before her shift. Mr. Wells walked back to his table, picking up another document. Your Honor, I have here a report from Sarah's school counselor. In it, she notes that Sarah has become increasingly withdrawn, shows signs of anxiety, and has missed multiple parent-teacher conferences. He turned back to Sarah. When was the last time your mother attended a school function? She tries. But with work, just answer the question. When? Sarah's voice came out barely above a whisper. Last year, at the science fair, and this year, the Halloween parade, Christmas concert, parent-teacher conferences. No. No to which? To all of them. Sarah's hands clenched around the textbook. But she wanted to come. She tried to switch shifts. Your Honor, Mr. Wells interrupted. I'd like to enter into evidence the work schedules from Chicago General Hospital, showing that Janet Johnson voluntarily picked up extra shifts beyond what was required to maintain her position. Sarah watched her mother flinch at the defense table. Mr. Patterson leaned over to whisper something to her, but she just shook her head. Sarah, Mr. Wells continued, did you know your mother wasn't required to work all those night shifts? That she chose to take them? She needed the money. For what? Your apartment rent is subsidized. You qualify for food assistance. Where was all this extra money going? Sarah looked at her mother, who gave her a small nod. For nursing school. Mom's trying to become an RN, so she won't have to work so many shifts anymore. Yes, the nursing program. Mr. Wells picked up yet another file, which she's failed to complete twice now, correct? Because she keeps missing classes? Objection. Mr. Patterson's voice was sharp. The witness couldn't possibly know. I withdraw the question. Mr. Wells straightened his blood-red tie. Sarah, has your mother ever talked about finding a different job? One with regular hours? She loves being a nurse. She's good at it. That's not what I asked. Sarah gripped the textbook tighter. No, she hasn't talked about other jobs. So she chose to continue working nights, knowing you'd be alone, knowing it was illegal, knowing it was dangerous. She did it for me. Did she? Mr. Wells stepped closer to the witness stand. Or did she do it for herself? Her career? Her ambitions? Objection. Mr. Patterson was on his feet again. Withdrawn, Mr. Wells turned to the judge. Your Honor, I have here reports from Child Protective Services documenting the unsafe conditions in which this child has been living. Unsupervised for hours, responsible for her own meals, her own safety. She taught me everything. Sarah burst out. How to heat food safely. How to check that doors were locked. She called every hour to make sure I was okay. Her voice broke as the tears finally came. Through the blur, she saw her mother crying silently at the defense table. Judge Henderson leaned forward. Sarah, would you like another break? She shook her head, wiping her eyes with her sleeve. No, I need to tell the truth. The courtroom fell silent. Even Mr. Wells paused, his next file halfway to the witness stand. The truth is, Sarah continued, her voice stronger now, sometimes I was scared. Sometimes I didn't want to be alone. But Mom always made sure I had everything I needed. Food, clean clothes, my homework checked, and every night, no matter how late, she'd sit on my bed and tell me about the patients she helped, how she made their lives better. She opened the medical textbook to a random page. She's learning all of this so we can have a better life. So other kids won't lose their parents to sickness, like some of her patients do. She's not perfect, but she's trying. She's trying so hard. Mr. Wells cleared his throat. Your Honor, while this is very touching, it doesn't change the fact that, Mr. Wells, Judge Henderson interrupted, I believe we've heard enough for now. Court will recess for lunch. We'll resume at 2 o'clock. The bailiff called for everyone to rise. As people began filing out of the courtroom, Sarah stayed in the witness chair, still holding the textbook. She watched her mother being led away by the court officers, their eyes meeting briefly before the door closed. Ms. Torres approached the witness stand. Ready for some lunch? Sarah shook her head. I don't think I can eat. You need to try. We still have the afternoon session. As they walked out of the courtroom, Sarah looked back at Judge Henderson's empty bench. She'd told the truth, all of it. Now she could only hope it was enough. The courthouse cafeteria buzzed with conversation, but Sarah couldn't eat. She pushed a sandwich around her plate, while Ms. Torres watched with concern. "Just 2 more bites," Ms. Torres urged. "You need your strength." Sarah managed one small bite. The bread felt like cotton in her mouth. Through the cafeteria windows, she could see dark clouds gathering. A storm was coming. "What happens now?" she asked. "Judge Henderson will want to hear more from you. This is your chance to explain why you want to stay with your mother." "Haven't I already told them everything?" Ms. Torres leaned forward. "You've told them the facts. Now they need to understand the feelings behind those facts." At 2 o'clock sharp, the bailiff called the court back to session. Sarah's legs felt heavy as she walked back to the witness stand. The medical textbook was still there, waiting for her. Judge Henderson adjusted her glasses. "Sarah, I have some questions for you." Sarah sat up straighter. The judge's voice was different now, less stern, more thoughtful. "In your own words," Judge Henderson said, "tell me why you believe you should remain in your mother's custody." Sarah opened her mouth, but no words came. All the practice sessions with Ms. Torres seemed to evaporate. In the gallery, she saw Tanya and Mrs. Carter sitting next to Ms. Torres. They must have come during the lunch break. "Take your time," Judge Henderson encouraged. A memory flashed through Sarah's mind, one she hadn't thought about in months. "Last winter," she began, "I got really sick. High fever. It was a night Mom was working. She heard Mr. Wells shuffle papers, probably looking for more evidence against her mother. But Judge Henderson held up a hand to silence him. "Continue, Sarah." "I called Mom at the hospital. She talked to her supervisor, explained the situation. Then she walked 3 miles home in a snowstorm because the buses weren't running. She sat up with me all night, checking my temperature, making me drink water. She missed her shift and almost lost her job, but she said I was more important." Sarah's fingers found the page in the textbook about fever management. Her mother's notes were there. "Check temp every hour. Watch for signs of dehydration." The next day, she taught me about fevers, how to check my temperature, when to take medicine, when to call for help. She showed me in this book. Sarah held up the textbook. "She doesn't just leave me alone. She teaches me how to be strong." Thunder rumbled outside. Rain began pattering against the courtroom windows. "Your Honor," Mr. Wells stood. "While this is a touching story, it actually demonstrates, Mr. Wells." Judge Henderson's voice was sharp. "I'd like to hear from Sarah without interruption." The prosecutor sat down, straightening his red tie with a tight expression. "Sarah," the judge continued, "do you understand that what your mother did, leaving you alone at night, was dangerous?" "Yes." Sarah's voice was steady now. "But being poor is dangerous too. Not having health insurance is dangerous. Mom says sometimes you have to choose between bad choices and worse ones." She saw her mother press a hand to her mouth at the defense table. "When Dad left, he took everything. The car, the savings, Mom's credit cards. She had to start over with nothing. But she never gave up. She worked whatever shifts they gave her. She went back to school, and she still made time to help me with homework, to make sure I ate good food, to teach me things." Sarah looked directly at Judge Henderson. "I know it wasn't perfect. I know she made mistakes. But she's trying to make things better. If she finishes nursing school, she can work regular hours. We can have a normal life. And in the meantime," Judge Henderson asked, "what about your safety?" "I'm safer with my mom than anywhere else." Sarah's voice cracked slightly. "She's all I have." The judge removed her glasses, rubbing the bridge of her nose. "Sarah, the law exists to protect children, even from well-meaning parents who make dangerous choices." "Then help us follow the law," Sarah pleaded. "Mom can change her shifts. I can go to after-school programs. We can figure it out. Just please don't take her away from me." Lightning flashed outside, followed by another rumble of thunder. The storm was directly overhead now. "Your Honor," Mr. Patterson stood. "If I may, we have letters from Janet Johnson's supervisors at the hospital. They're willing to adjust her schedule to accommodate day shifts. And the hospital's employee assistance program has offered to help with childcare costs." Mr. Wells rose quickly. "Your Honor, these arrangements were made after the fact. They don't excuse." "No," Judge Henderson agreed. "They don't excuse past actions. But they do suggest a path forward." She turned back to Sarah. "One last question. What do you want to be when you grow up?" Sarah didn't hesitate. "A doctor, like the ones Mom works with." Why a doctor? Because... Sarah looked down at the textbook, at all her mother's careful notes. Because I want to help people. Like Mom does. She always says that being a nurse isn't just about medicine. It's about being there for people on their worst days. Making them feel less alone. The judge was quiet for a long moment, looking at her notes. The only sound was the rain against the windows and the occasional rumble of thunder. Finally, Judge Henderson looked up. I'd like to speak with both attorneys in my chambers. Court will recess for 30 minutes. As the judge left the bench, Ms. Torres came to help Sarah down from the witness stand. Her legs felt shaky after sitting for so long. You did wonderfully, Ms. Torres whispered. They sat in the gallery with Mrs. Carter and Tanya. Sarah watched the court officers lead her mother out a side door. Did I say enough? She asked Ms. Torres. You said exactly what needed to be said. Now we wait. The 30 minutes felt like hours. Sarah counted the ceiling tiles, read random pages in the textbook, watched the storm through the windows. Finally, the bailiff called everyone back to order. Judge Henderson returned to the bench, her expression unreadable. Sarah held her breath. After careful consideration of all testimony and evidence, the judge began, and after discussion with counsel, I'm prepared to make my ruling. Sarah reached for Ms. Torres's hand, squeezing it tight. Janet Johnson has made serious errors in judgment. Leaving a child alone at night is never acceptable, regardless of the circumstances. Sarah's heart sank. But Judge Henderson wasn't finished. However, I also see a mother doing her best in impossible circumstances. More importantly, I see a child who is loved, educated, and despite everything, thriving. The judge shuffled some papers on her bench. Therefore, I'm ordering a conditional release. Ms. Johnson will be placed on probation for 6 months. During this time, she must maintain regular day shifts, ensure proper childcare arrangements, and continue her nursing education. Monthly visits from social services will monitor compliance. Sarah could hardly breathe. Next to her, Ms. Torres was smiling. If these conditions are met consistently, Judge Henderson continued, the case will be reviewed in 6 months with the possibility of dismissal. Court is adjourned. The bang of the gavel seemed to echo through Sarah's whole body. She stood on shaky legs as court officers led her mother through a side door. Mom! They ran to each other, meeting in a tight embrace. Sarah buried her face in her mother's hospital scrubs, breathing in the familiar smell of laundry soap and home. You did it, baby, her mother whispered, stroking her hair. You did it? We did it, Sarah corrected, holding up the medical textbook. Together, outside, the storm was passing. Through the courthouse windows, Sarah could see patches of blue sky beginning to show through the clouds. Her mother's arm was around her shoulders, solid and real and there. They were going home. The processing room at the courthouse was cold and sterile. Sarah sat in a plastic chair, still holding her mother's medical textbook, while adults moved around them with papers to sign and procedures to follow. Just a few more forms, Mr. Patterson said, his tie loosened after the long day. Then you can go home. Home. The word felt strange after nearly a week away. Sarah watched her mother sign document after document, her hands steady despite everything. Initial here, a clerk instructed, and here. Full signature on the last page. Ms. Torres sat next to Sarah, completing her own paperwork. I'll be visiting twice a month to check in. Just standard procedure. What about my stuff at Mrs. Carter's? Sarah asked. We'll get it tomorrow, her mother answered. Not looking up from the forms, it's too late tonight. Outside, the sun was setting. The storm had left the air clean and cool. Sarah could see police cars and news vans in the parking lot through the small window. There's media interest in your case, Mr. Patterson warned. We can escort you out the back way. No, Sarah's mother said firmly, signing the last form. We're not sneaking around anymore. We'll use the front door. A court officer returned her belongings. The contents of her pockets from the night of her arrest. A set of keys. A hospital ID badge. A worn wallet. She changed out of the orange jumpsuit into her wrinkled scrubs from that night. Ready? She asked Sarah, holding out her hand. They walked through the courthouse corridors together, their footsteps echoing on the marble floors. Ms. Torres and Mr. Patterson flanked them like guards. As they approached the main entrance, they could hear the murmur of voices outside. "Remember," Mr. Patterson said quietly, "you don't have to answer any questions. Just walk to the car." The heavy doors opened. Camera flashes burst like lightning. Reporters called out questions. "Ms. Johnson, how do you respond to allegations of neglect? What changes will you make to keep your daughter? Sarah, how does it feel to testify against your own mother?" Sarah felt her mother's hand tighten around hers. They walked down the courthouse steps together, neither one looking at the cameras. Ms. Torres's car was waiting at the curb, engine running. "Get in quickly," she instructed, opening the back door. Inside the car, the noise became muffled. Sarah watched the reporters through tinted windows as Ms. Torres pulled away from the curb. "The media attention will die down in a few days," Mr. Patterson said from the front seat. "Until then, keep your doors locked and don't talk to any reporters." They drove through familiar streets that somehow looked different now. Past the hospital where her mother worked. Past Sarah's school, dark and empty at this hour. Finally, they turned onto their street. The apartment building looked the same, but something was different. Sarah realized what it was as they climbed the stairs to the third floor. "The door," she said quietly. The broken door from the night of the arrest had been replaced with a new one. Solid wood with a brass knocker and 3 locks. "The building manager installed it," Ms. Torres explained. "Part of our safety plan." Sarah's mother's hand shook slightly as she tried her key in the new locks. Inside, the apartment smelled musty from being closed up for days. Her homework still lay scattered on the coffee table where she'd left it that night. Mr. Patterson set his briefcase on the kitchen counter. "We need to go over the probation conditions. The sooner we implement everything, the better. Can it wait until tomorrow?" Sarah's mother asked. I need a minute." "Of course." He packed up his papers. "I'll come by in the morning." 9 o'clock. After Mr. Patterson left, Ms. Torres did a quick walkthrough of the apartment. "I'll need to document any safety changes we make. But that can wait too. Do you need anything before I go?" Sarah's mother shook her head. "We'll be okay. Remember, call me if you need anything. Anytime." When Ms. Torres finally left, the silence in the apartment felt heavy. Sarah stood in the living room, unsure what to do next. Her mother hadn't moved from the kitchen. "Mom, I'm okay, baby." But her voice cracked on the words. "I just need a minute." Sarah watched her mother sink into a kitchen chair, her face in her hands. For a moment, only her shoulders shaking gave away her tears. Without a word, Sarah filled the electric kettle and took out 2 mugs. Her mother had taught her how to make tea years ago, one of many survival skills passed down. She found the chamomile tea bags in the cabinet, right where they'd always been. The familiar routine steadied her hands. Boil water, steep tea, add honey. She placed 1 mug in front of her mother and sat down with her own. "When did you get so grown up?" her mother asked, wiping her eyes. "I'm not. I was scared the whole time. Being brave doesn't mean you're not scared." Her mother took a sip of tea. "It means you do what needs to be done anyway." They sat in silence for a while, drinking tea in the dim kitchen. Outside, a siren wailed in the distance, a normal sound in their neighborhood. "Things have to change," her mother finally said. "Real changes, not just promises." "I know. I start day shifts next week, 7 to 3. But that means I'll need to drop nursing classes for now." "Mom, no. Just for a little while. Until we get settled. The hospital has a childcare program. It'll take most of my overtime pay, but you'll have somewhere to go after school." Sarah stared into her tea. "What about your dream? Being an RN? You're my dream." Her mother reached across the table, taking her hand. "Everything else can wait." A knock at the door made them both jump. Sarah's mother was on her feet instantly, moving toward the door. "Who is it?" "Chicago PD, ma'am." "Welfare check." She checked through the new peephole before opening the door. 2 officers stood in the hallway, not the same ones from that night. "Just confirming the premises are secure," one officer said. "Part of the release conditions." They did a quick check of the locks, the windows, the smoke detectors. Made notes on their clipboards. Asked if they felt safe. "We're fine," Sarah's mother assured them. "Thank you." After they left, she double-checked all 3 locks on the door. "That'll happen every night for a while. Random checks." Sarah nodded. It should have felt intrusive, but somehow it didn't. It felt like proof that things were really changing. You should get ready for bed, her mother said. It's late. Sarah went through her bedtime routine. Brush teeth, wash face, change into pajamas. Everything was just as she'd left it that night. Even her toothbrush was still lying by the sink where she'd dropped it when the police came. Her mother appeared in the bathroom doorway. I called the school. You can go back tomorrow if you want. Or take another day if you need it. I want to go. Sarah met her mother's eyes in the mirror. I'm not hiding anymore either. In her bedroom, Sarah found her mother had already turned down the covers and set out clean clothes for tomorrow. Small things, normal things that had been missing this past week. Mom, she called as her mother turned to leave. Will you stay? Just until I fall asleep? Without a word, her mother lay down next to her on the narrow bed. Sarah curled in her side, breathing in the hospital smell that still clung to her scrubs. I'm sorry, her mother whispered into the darkness. For all of it. I know. When your father left, I thought I had to be perfect, had to prove I could do it all alone. Instead, I almost lost you too. Sarah clutched her mother's hand. But you didn't. We're still here? Yes. Her mother's voice grew stronger. We're still here? They lay there together, listening to the city sounds outside their window. A car horn, a distant train, the rattle of the old heating system coming to life. Just before sleep took her, Sarah heard her mother whisper, "Tomorrow will be better. I promise." For the first time in a long time, Sarah believed it. The apartment smelled like coffee and toast when Sarah woke up. For a moment, she thought she was dreaming. It had been months since breakfast smells had greeted her in the morning. 10 minutes until breakfast. Her mother called from the kitchen. Sarah sat up slowly, remembering everything. The courthouse. The verdict. Coming home. She got dressed in the clothes her mother had laid out. Her favorite jeans and a clean blue sweater. In the kitchen, her mother stood at the stove in fresh scrubs, making scrambled eggs. 2 plates were already set on the table. You're really here, Sarah said. Her mother turned, spatula in hand. Day shift, remember? 7 to 3. That means breakfast together every morning. They sat down to eat. The eggs were a little overdone, the toast slightly burnt, but to Sarah, it was the best breakfast she'd ever had. Mrs. Carter dropped off your backpack this morning, her mother said. And Ms. Torres called. She'll pick you up after school and take you to the hospital's daycare center. I'll meet you there when my shift ends. Sarah pushed her eggs around her plate. Daycare? Like for little kids? It's an after-school program. They have homework help activities. Kids your age. Her mother checked the clock. We need to leave in 10 minutes. You okay with going back today? Sarah nodded, though her stomach tightened at the thought. Everyone would know where she'd been, why she'd missed school. But hiding wouldn't make it easier. They walked to school together, something they hadn't done since Sarah was in elementary school. The morning was cool and clear after yesterday's storm. Other parents and kids walked the same route, some giving them curious looks. At the school gates, her mother knelt to fix Sarah's sweater. If anyone gives you trouble, go to the counselor. And if you need me, call the hospital. Sarah managed a small smile. I know. I love you, baby. Love you too, Mom. Sarah watched her mother walk away, heading toward the hospital 6 blocks over. Then she turned and walked into school. The whispers started immediately. Kids went quiet as she passed, then burst into conversation behind her. In homeroom, her regular seat was empty, like everyone had been saving it for her return. Sarah? Mrs. Peterson, her teacher, called her aside before class. The counselor would like to see you at lunch. Just to check in. The morning passed in a blur of makeup work and sideways glances. In math, they were starting a new unit. Sarah stared at her textbook, trying to catch up. At lunch, she went to the counselor's office instead of the cafeteria. Ms. Williams sat behind her desk, a kind smile on her face. How are you holding up? Sarah shrugged. Okay, I guess. It's normal to feel overwhelmed. A lot has changed very quickly. Yeah. Would you like to talk about it? Sarah looked out the window. From here, she could just see the top of the hospital building where her mother was working. Everything's different now, she said finally. But also the same? I don't know how to explain it. Try. Mom's home in the mornings. She'll be home at night. But people look at us different now. Like they're waiting for something bad to happen. Ms. Williams nodded. That will fade with time. People have short memories. After school, Ms. Torres waited in her silver sedan. The drive to the hospital was quiet until they pulled into the parking lot. The after-school program is in that building, Ms. Torres pointed. Your mother will pick you up at 3:30. I'll check in tomorrow, okay? The program room was bright and noisy. Kids of various ages sat at tables doing homework or playing games. A young woman with braids introduced herself as Miss Angela. You can set up here, she gestured to an empty table. We have snacks in 20 minutes, then homework time. Sarah took out her math book, but she couldn't focus. Every few minutes she checked the clock, counting down until 3:30. At exactly 3:30, her mother appeared in the doorway, still in her scrubs. A few other parents were arriving too, all hospital staff in similar uniforms. How was it? Her mother asked as they walked to the bus stop. Weird, but okay. The bus was crowded with people heading home from work. Sarah and her mother found seats near the back, her mother's hospital badge still clipped to her scrubs. My supervisor called me in today, her mother said as the bus lurched forward. They're offering me a permanent position on day shift. Better pay, regular hours. What about night shift differential? We'll manage. The important thing is being home with you. At their stop, they walked the 2 blocks to their apartment. More police cars than usual patrolled the street, part of the court-ordered monitoring. Inside, Sarah started her homework at the kitchen table while her mother made dinner. Not leftovers or microwave meals, but actual cooking. The apartment filled with the smell of chicken and rice. Need help with that? Her mother asked, looking over Sarah's shoulder at the math problems. It's a new unit. I missed the first lesson. Let's figure it out together. They worked through the problems slowly, her mother reading the textbook examples while stirring the pot on the stove. It took longer than doing it alone, but somehow the math made more sense. After dinner, there was another welfare check. Different officers this time, but the same questions. Same clipboard. Same careful inspection of locks and windows. All secure, one officer noted. Have a good night, Ms. Johnson. Her mother closed the door behind them, all 3 locks clicking into place. That's 3 checks today. They'll probably do one more before morning. Does it bother you? Sarah asked. Having them check on us all the time? No. Her mother's voice was firm. If it keeps you safe, they can check 100 times. They settled on the couch to watch TV. Not because Sarah was alone and needed the noise, but because they wanted to. Her mother had changed out of her scrubs into comfortable clothes. Sarah leaned against her shoulder, breathing in the familiar scent of hospital soap mixed with their laundry detergent. A knock at the door startled them both. Chicago PD. Final welfare check. Her mother sighed, but got up to answer it. Same routine. Check locks, check windows, sign papers. Tomorrow too? Sarah asked after they left. For a while, until they're sure we're following all the rules. Later, getting ready for bed, Sarah heard her mother on the phone in the kitchen. Yes, she's adjusting. No, I understand regular visits are necessary. Yes, I'll have the childcare paperwork ready for review. In her room, Sarah found her mother's medical textbook on her pillow. A note stuck out from between the pages. Your turn to study. Dream big, baby girl. Sarah opened to the marked page. It was the chapter on pediatric care. Her mother's handwriting filled the margins. Children are resilient, but need stability. Routine equals security. Presence matters more than perfection. Her mother appeared in the doorway. Ready for bed? Can we read some first? They sat together on Sarah's bed, the textbook open between them. Her mother explained medical terms, shared stories about her patients, talked about why she loved being a nurse. Maybe someday we'll work in the same hospital, Sarah said. You'll be an RN, and I'll be a doctor. Her mother was quiet for a moment. About that, I've been thinking maybe I don't need to quit the nursing program completely. The hospital offers night classes. If I take just 1 or 2 at a time, really, it'll take longer, but we'll do it right this time. Together, a siren wailed somewhere in the city. Through the window, Sarah could see police lights reflecting off nearby buildings. But for the first time, those things didn't make her feel alone or afraid. Mom? I'm glad you're home. Her mother hugged her close. Me too, baby. Me too. 3 months passed like water flowing downstream. The police checks became less frequent, then stopped altogether. The reporters found other stories to chase. Life settled into a new rhythm, steady and sure. Sarah sat in the hospital cafeteria, homework spread across the table. The after-school program had ended an hour ago, but her mother's shift ran late due to an emergency. She didn't mind. The cafeteria ladies knew her now, sometimes slipping her extra pudding cups. "Looking good, Doc," one of them called out as she passed. The nickname had stuck after Sarah started wearing her mother's old stethoscope around her neck while studying. Her mother appeared in the cafeteria doorway, still in her scrubs. "Sorry I'm late, baby. Had a difficult case?" "It's okay. I finished my science project." They gathered her books and papers, making their way to the bus stop. The early evening air was warm. Spring had finally arrived in Chicago. "Miss Torres is coming tomorrow," her mother said as they waited for the bus. "Final home visit before the court review." Sarah nodded. The 6-month probation period was almost over. Next week, they'd go back to court to have the case reviewed. "Are you nervous?" she asked. "A little, but we've done everything right. Followed all the rules." The bus ride home was crowded with hospital staff changing shifts. Several nurses called out greetings to her mother. One of them, Nancy, sat next to them. "Janet, did you hear about the promotion?" Nancy asked. "They're posting the new charge nurse position next week." "I saw the listing," her mother replied. "I'm thinking about applying." "You should. Your patient satisfaction scores are through the roof." At their stop, they walked the familiar 2 blocks home. No police cars patrolled their street anymore. The building manager had installed better lighting in the hallways, and the elevator finally worked consistently. Inside their apartment, Sarah went through her usual routine. Change clothes, start homework, help with dinner prep. But now her mother worked alongside her, making real meals instead of relying on microwave leftovers. "How's the night class going?" Sarah asked, chopping vegetables while her mother checked chicken in the oven. "Good. Exam next week on cardiac care." Her mother smiled. "Want to quiz me?" They went through flashcards while dinner cooked. Sarah had learned most of the medical terminology by now, helping her mother study for her RN program. One class at a time, slow but steady progress. The phone rang. Ms. Torres confirming tomorrow's visit. "Have the paperwork ready," she reminded them. School records, work schedules, childcare logs. After dinner, they spread documents across the kitchen table. 3 months of perfect attendance at school. Steady improvement in Sarah's grades. Her mother's work evaluations, all positive. Sign-in sheets from the after-school program. "Remember when we used to hide everything?" Sarah asked, sorting through the papers. "Now we have to show everything." Her mother paused in her organizing. "I was so afraid back then. Afraid of losing you, losing my job, losing everything. I thought hiding was the only way. And now I know better. Asking for help isn't weakness. It's how we got stronger." A knock at the door made them both look up. Not the sharp rap of police checks, but a gentler sound. "Mrs. Rodriguez," her mother said, opening the door to their neighbor. "Come in." The older woman entered, carrying a covered dish. "I made too much arroz con pollo. Thought you girls might like some." 3 months ago, they'd barely spoken to their neighbors, afraid of questions about their situation. Now, Mrs. Rodriguez brought food several times a week, and Sarah sometimes helped her carry groceries upstairs. "Stay for coffee," her mother offered. They sat around the kitchen table, papers pushed aside for plates of food. Mrs. Rodriguez told stories about her own children, now grown with families of their own. "You're doing good," she said to Sarah's mother. "I see the change in both of you." After she left, Sarah helped clean up while her mother packed lunches for tomorrow. The apartment felt different now. Lived in, warm, a real home instead of just a place they slept. "Bath and bed," her mother said. "Big day tomorrow." In her room, Sarah found her mother's medical textbook on her desk. She'd started reading it regularly, not just for comfort now, but with real understanding. The margins were filled with both their handwriting, her mother's neat notes about procedures, Sarah's questions and observations. Her mother came in to say goodnight, sitting on the edge of the bed like always. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, seeing Sarah's thoughtful expression. "Remember that first night back home? After court?" "Of course. You promised things would be better." Sarah looked around her room, at the science fair ribbon on her wall, the small desk lamp for late-night studying, the family photos they'd finally put up. "You kept your promise." Her mother's eyes glistened. We kept it together. The next morning, Ms. Torres arrived exactly on time. She walked through the apartment with her clipboard, checking off boxes, inspected the locks that hadn't needed replacing, reviewed their documentation. "The judge will be pleased," she said finally. "You've exceeded all expectations." "What happens after court?" Sarah asked. "Will you stop visiting?" Ms. Torres smiled. "Miss me already?" "Maybe a little. I'll check in occasionally, but unofficially, just to see how my favorite future doctor is doing." After she left, Sarah and her mother got ready for their day. The normal routine of breakfast, backpacks, bus rides. At school, Sarah's teachers no longer gave her worried looks. Her friends had stopped whispering when she walked by. In class, they were studying the human body and science. Sarah raised her hand to answer questions about the circulatory system, knowledge gained from hours of reading her mother's textbooks. "Very impressive," her teacher said. "You might have a future in medicine." At lunch, she sat with her regular group of friends. No longer the girl whose mother went to jail, just Sarah, who wanted to be a doctor someday. After school, the hospital's daycare program was busy with kids doing homework and playing games. Sarah helped some younger children with their math, remembering how her mother had helped her catch up after missing school. Her mother picked her up right on time, changed out of her scrubs and clean clothes for her evening class. "Ready to go home?" Sarah looked at her mother, really looked at her. The tired lines around her eyes had softened. She stood straighter, smiled more easily. The fear that had lived in her shoulders for so long had finally released its grip. "Yeah," Sarah said. "Let's go home." They walked out of the hospital together, past the nursery where her mother had once worked night shifts, past the cafeteria where Sarah now did her homework, past the classrooms where her mother was slowly, steadily working toward her RN degree. Outside, the spring sun was setting, painting the city in soft colors. Other hospital workers headed home to their families. Buses rumbled past. Life moved forward in its ordinary way. But for Sarah and her mother, ordinary had become extraordinary. Every dinner together, every homework session, every bedtime story was a small miracle. Proof that broken things could be mended, that lost things could be found, that love could build a bridge strong enough to carry them home. They boarded their usual bus, finding seats together near the back. Sarah leaned against her mother's shoulder, tired but content. "Mom, I'm proud of us." Her mother kissed the top of her head. "Me too, baby. Me too." The bus rolled through their neighborhood, carrying them toward their apartment, toward their future, toward all the ordinary miracles still waiting to unfold. Sarah held her mother's hand, feeling the strength in both their grips. They were no longer hiding, no longer afraid, no longer alone. They were home,